Good evening. Welcome to all of you who are joining us tonight for the second session of the 2025 South Dakota Vegetable Short Course. I'm Rhoda Burrows. I'm SDSU Extension Horticulture Specialist working with fruit and vegetable growers across the state, and I will be your host tonight. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that this year's South Dakota Virtual Vegetable Short Course is made impossible in part with funding from USDA, NIFA Organic Transitions Program, and the North Central Region's their professional development. Each short course session will be available on the SDSU Extension YouTube channel to rewatch and share with others, and we'll put that link in the chat box for you. Tonight, I'm pleased to welcome Alexis Barnes, Local Food Systems Small Farms Educator with the University of Illinois Extension. You may remember Alexis from previous years, as she is a graduate of our SDSU Vegetable Crops Research Program. She is now based in St. Charles, Illinois, where she works with small farmers, nonprofits, community members to deliver research-based education and outreach for those who are involved with the local food system in the Chicagoland area. Her programming and expert assistance focuses on reduced tillage practices, integrated pest management, and organic vegetable production with an increasing interest in livestock integration. And if you want to learn more or connect with Alexis in the future, we'll put a link to her profile in the chat. So tonight, Alexis will be discussing challenges of unusual weather patterns and crop failures on specialty crop farms in northern Illinois, and give us some ideas about how to navigate those challenges in different Midwestern landscapes. And I'll just close out with a reminder to remember to put your questions in the Q&A box. Thanks, and I'll turn it over to Alexis.
Hi, everyone. It is nice to be back talking to a South Dakota audience. You should be receiving a poll first, and then I can talk a little bit about what we've been seeing in Illinois. I don't know if I can see when the poll ends, so let me know, or I might get a box, Dr. Burrows and Kara. But yeah, our weather patterns are starting to get a little funky here, as we saw in South Dakota my 2 years there. But we'll be talking about everything from weather to, pest concerns, disease concerns, what it's like farming in an urban, suburban, and rural area. Yeah, it's a fun time. Is the poll still out? Sorry, I'm new to the polling situation.
Yep, the poll is still out. We're gonna end it here.
Okay.
Probably we'll end it now. And the results are sharing, so everybody can kind of see what people voted on.
Okay, cool. Thank you. Yeah, so this isn't surprising. We had all of those concerns here. I kept up a little bit on South Dakota weather this summer and saw that parts of it had a really bad flood. And we saw some of that here too. So I will talk about it. I am going to turn off my camera, but I will still be here. So, all right. So I want to dig into what it's been like in Illinois. So here's a brief outline of what we're going to be talking about. Who the heck am I besides that I was, in South Dakota? We'll talk a little bit about Illinois weather and topography. We'll also talk about the odd weather patterns that we're seeing, as well as the insect pests, production concerns, and marketability. I will touch a little bit on that because I do think, with all of this weather, it is impacting some of our marketability and things at the markets. And we'll talk about our take-home message and some acknowledgments. And just for reference, the bolded Tri-County unit up there is where I serve. However, I do have colleagues all over Northern Illinois, so I did talk to them about some things that they're experiencing as well, and that I is where the University Urbana-Champaign is. So who am I? I have a bachelor's degree in geography and sustainability from Indiana State University, and I worked on a fruit and vegetable farm there, certified organic in Southern Indiana, and I also started a food forest project while I was at Indiana State that is still going on, and that's basically where my vegetable journey really started. I knew I really wanted to go to grad school, and so miraculously, I emailed Dr. Lang and Dr. Burrows a few days apart, and they had a research position. So you've probably heard me talk about living mulch research. That's what I studied for 2 years in South Dakota, was a clover living mulch and broccoli, bell pepper, in an organic winter squash production that I believe is now certified organic with sweet corn and cabbage. You'll be hearing about that next week. I was graduated in May, and I came back to my roots, which is the Chicagoland area. So I serve a tri-county area, DuPage, Kane, and Kendall counties. But I have experience, going down to zone 7 and, zone 4 and parts of 5 in South Dakota. So I tend to get a lot of random questions. And my background is vegetable production with reduced tillage. So I get questions anywhere from, what is this cover crop to what is this pest and how do I manage this disease? And my chicken looks funny, even though livestock isn't my thing, which is so fun. So yeah, it's fun to come back to my roots and work with some farmers that I grew up with, and, educate the people on local foods because that's a huge need here. So let's talk about the type of farmers that I do serve because it is very interesting and it is a little bit differently in a cultural way compared to South Dakota. So again, there's the map for reference. So I serve DuPage, Kane, and Kendall. Those are the Chicagoland counties. So in that top corner next to that further east county is Cook County. That is inner city Chicago. So I can see a mix of urban, suburban, and rural. Most of the farmers I work with are either urban or rural. I don't really help too many suburban farmers just because the land plots get really funky. But it creates really unique situations and challenges when we start to work with those communities. I have 100 specialty crop growers alone in Kane County. That's where St. Charles is based, with very few in DuPage, as well as Kendall. My furthest east county in Chicago, it's very expensive to live there, especially with land. So I don't have many growers there. But we also have a mix of certified organic as well as conventional growers. We are seeing a bigger influx to the certified naturally grown certification just because of how organic it can be kind of expensive to do and it can deter people away. But we do see a lot of people in Chicago really like the label just because they're not fully aware of how farmers are really treated, especially in their production systems. And another unique thing, I thought this was different from South Dakota. Every farmer I know has a full-time job. There usually isn't two people on the farm that, aren't working. Usually both of them are working full-time jobs. Now, I know that, it's different everywhere, and South Dakota, I'm sure, does have some of that. But usually there's not even one spouse that's on the farm. They're both working. And that's just because of how expensive it is. And so that can also create some production challenges with how they're able to get out into the field and treat some of these concerns, especially when it comes to disease and pests and when they can make it to the market. But this is a mix of beginning, new, and generational growers. And it really sets the stage for a tight-knit community that does support one another, which is honestly amazing. I teach a master urban farmer training course. That's why I was started, which is why I was hired, which helps beginner farmers kind of pave their way into the urban landscape, which is really fun. So less about that. Let's talk about the topography and some of the weather patterns that we are seeing. So, you know, in 2023, the hardiness map did change a little bit. And where that star is on the map again is where I serve. So it's funky. So Illinois has three different growing zones. We've got 5A in that driftless region over there to the left. And then I'm in 5B. Parts of me is in 6A. Chicago sits in this weird little nook that also can affect our daylight as well as our growing temperatures. So it's very interesting what they're able to grow than what we are in the suburbs sometimes, and how they can stretch things. And some of that is affected by our urban infrastructure. So we are typically an alpha soil mixed with some mollisol soil in there. So, you know, we do have that light colored clay. It's hard to say, say it fast 3 times. With mollisol sprinkled in. So, you know, with development in those urban areas, you know, they do strip that top layer. So we are left with a lot of really heavy clay, which can make production a little difficult, which I will be talking about later. We are historically rainy. June is typically our rainy month, but that is shifting. We are seeing a drought usually throughout the whole summer with really heavy rains in July that is starting to flood our fields. And we are in a precipitation deficit as well. So we are seeing a decrease in precipitation throughout the whole year, which is also what we are seeing in the winter with them being milder. We aren't getting as much snow. Actually, this week is the first week we've really received like a true dumping of snow. But it's also creating such weird growing systems because growers are able to maintain their high tunnels until like early December and grow tomatoes in them, which is insane. It's good for the markets, but rather crazy if you really think about it. And so, like I said, these urban areas can create a heat island effect. So they can be anywhere from 2 to 7 degrees. Oh my gosh, I can't speak tonight. Sorry. They can be anywhere from 2 to 7 degrees Fahrenheit warmer compared to more of my rural areas. And it's actually less windy in the city, which is very funny for the windy city. But it's very windy in our rural areas. Not as windy as South Dakota, but it's very windy. So fastening your high tunnels and row covers out here is really important, as well as South Dakota. Most of northeastern Illinois is influenced by Lake Michigan. It can cause cooler winds in the summer, but it also causes random snowfall in the winter, and it can feel colder here than it would in South Dakota. Like 30 degrees here, like it's actually really cold. I'm not a coat person and I need a coat, versus 30 degrees in South Dakota. I mean, I would walk around free unless it was extremely windy. And it can also be very humid here. And so people tend to work in their high tunnels very early in the morning, very late. So sunrise and sunset is the typical time that they would go out and work, because it's not fun. Okay. So let's go into the drought concerns because that's a really huge topic I'm seeing across the whole Midwest, especially when we start to talk about water. So for context, when I talked about it raining, it wasn't common for my farmers to have irrigation in the past. It wasn't always the norm. They could time their crops with the rain, especially their cover crops. And now it's to the point that they like have to have irrigation. In my class, we basically say you have to have it or else you're not going to survive. And that never used to be the case. And so it's causing farmers to have to, you know, install irrigation, which is really costly, or they're having to take water tanks out there and water just to have their plants survive, not even necessarily thrive. And so it's really throwing off our weather patterns. When I was a kid, if we would have a dry summer, it was just kind of a one-off season, you know, but now it's like it's becoming year after year. The past 3 years we have been in a drought here. It can also lead to increased pest concerns. I saw a big outbreak of aphids this year, and I would follow the label and spray, and it was like no matter what happened, it just got worse. until a rain came that seems to disrupt their communities, as well as cabbage loopers. So that's definitely an issue, and as well as weeds. We saw with my living mulch when I was in South Dakota that, when you don't irrigate crops or cover crops, they will die, obviously, and the drought tolerant weeds will start to take over and infiltrate the environment. And that can also be a vector for pests, that can be a vector for disease, and that can cause concerns. But that also leads into the untimely rains. And so, we're used to a lot of rain here. I believe we're about 10 to 20 inches, usually more than South Dakota every year. But now, because we are in this weird drought system and precipitation deficit, anytime we do get rain, it's starting to cause us to flood, because our ground just can't soak it up quick enough almost. Or if it does, it's just so dry that it's just a huge influx of rain it can't handle. But when we do get these floods, our root crops and brassicas tend to endure the most damage. One of my colleagues, our horticulture coordinator, she lives on a generational farm, and her red onions took the brunt of a flood that we had, and that was her major crop at the market that she would sell. And so she did see a decrease in value in that crop, which is really disheartening to see. So trying to navigate that is really difficult as well, because, when I was in South Dakota, this is another thing we experience, is that sometimes when you do get rain, it's only like a quarter inch of rain. So it's like hardly anything. And when you're in a drought, by the time you get it, the soil just soaks it up immediately and it feels like nothing happened. Or for us, we'll just get a string of rain for 3 days. And so it's just becoming incredibly hard to manage, but it's also raising the question of living mulches and cover cropping, because we don't really have a lot of living mulch research here in Illinois, surprisingly, with how many growers we have. And so Connor Ruin is at SDSU right now. He's a grad student that took over my plots, and he's doing infiltration research. We're starting to see, that clovers and living mulches can increase infiltration into soils with the porosity that it does penetrating the soil. So that's also something that growers are starting to look into to kind of help with these floods and manage that water. But it also, you need water to help irrigate these things from the start. So it can be kind of costly. And when we do get these rains, it leads to disease concerns, like fusarium and early blight and alternaria. And it's not fun, which I will also talk about. So we are also seeing odd frosts and intense heat. And so with our hard fall frosts, this year we didn't get it until mid-November, which we usually get it in mid-October. So we're about a week later than South Dakota. And it's fine. Growers aren't, too upset, I guess. It brings more money to the market, more things to the market, and the consumers get excited. But when you start to lay off staff for the season, or you're not expecting it, it can throw some people off. And, farmers are the stewards of the earth. And so they do kind of question some of these climate concerns. And so we are also seeing that the May frost, usually our mid frost, we're done by early to mid-May. We can start planting tomatoes, but the past few years, we've been also seeing cold snaps at the end of the month, which is also causing blossom drop on a lot of our fruiting crops as well. And it's, taking away people's harvests as well. And so some growers, in the agritourism realm, I don't recommend this if you're not like safe with fire, but they will literally light certain structures on fire in their fields to help maintain heat. Granted, these are trained people, they know what they're doing, but they will do that to maintain heat so their apple crop doesn't suffer from blossom drop, which is like really interesting and really innovative that I would never think about. Another thing that some growers are doing in these odd months is, I have a grower that's an engineer. I think farmers that are engineers are so fun. They have such innovative ideas too. He developed this weird tubing system to go into his compost that would heat his high tunnel from how hot the compost got, and it was a huge cost saver for him. So that was another way that he was able to mitigate some of those intense cold snaps that we would get. And I experienced a little bit of this in my first year in South Dakota. We had a cool July this past summer, and so it's frustrating for solanum crops, and so our tomatoes won't completely ripen when they're supposed to. It will delay a lot of that, and so that's, you know, typically prime canning season is late July, early August for us, and so that can also cause a hindrance. And then when those intense falls come in heat, our brassicas just tend to bolt, and then people don't usually get their salad greens as much. So we are noticing that as well. And so trying to use shade cloth if those are in a high tunnels can definitely help, as well as meso tunnels can help a little bit, but it's really just a matter of, you know, environmental concerns at that point. So let's jump into the fun stuff. Let's talk a little bit about disease and pests. So I am not a plant pathologist. I am a production horticulturalist. So I am not, you know, super in tune to diseases. I didn't really have to deal with them as much in South Dakota, but because we are rainier here, we do experience it a little bit more. And a lot of diseases are airborne. So we also have to worry about that here with growers being so close to each other. So early blight was a huge issue this summer, as well as fusarium, which early blight is a pathogen that, you know, it is soil borne. So it can overwinter in the soil, especially in the Midwest. It can also be introduced by transplants as well. So I was not able to seed start this year for some things that I was doing. I bought from a greenhouse, and they did have early blight issues. And so sometimes when you do purchase from other people, that is something to think about. But it can also stay in your soil. So that is another thing to think about as well. And so when you get early blight, those lower leaves tend to show signs first, which is browning and yellowing, because they are closer to the soil. And so they're going to see most of that first. And so usually the crops that are affected by this are peppers, tomatoes, and potatoes. They may not contribute to yield decreases. Research has not shown that, but it does affect the protective foliage, which can also lead to sun scalding. Mainly because when you are trying to treat this, the best solution is to remove the leaves. And then watering the plants at the base of the stem, you know, using drip irrigation would be really good for this. Because when you remove the leaves, it's good. You're getting rid of those infected parts, but you're also removing the protective foliage that protects those fruiting crops from sun scald. And I did notice on my plants when I did remove those leaves, they started to get really wobbly and top heavy. So that's another thing to consider. Make sure that they're really staked. And you are going to lose some of that foliage that does protect it from sun scald. So I did have some issues there. So I don't recommend seed saving if you have issues with this. You know, I know some growers really swear by that, but if you have disease problems, you're just going to have it again. So please don't seed save if that's the issue. You can also buy disease resistant varieties. I know for tomatoes and peppers, there are a lot of disease resistant varieties out there now for early blight. And another way to help with this is just removing debris from the field and increasing your airflow to plants. So, you know, if you know that you have this, you know, in general, when it comes field cleanup time, you shouldn't leave the plants in the field. They should be taken and, you know, burned or, you know, gotten rid of in a far away place from you, because you will have the issue again. And it can also create a place for pests to live as well. And I wanted to touch on just some other diseases I saw this year. Fusarium in general was just a concern. In one of my counties, I got a call. It was so sad about Fusarium basal rot in onions and garlic. Their main crop is garlic. That's all that they grow. So you can only imagine, you know, what this did to their income. They lost 50% of their crop doing this. And With Fusarium basalrod, it starts to get really mushy and black. And they, sometimes you don't notice until post-harvest handling. And for this grower, an example, they didn't notice until post-harvest handling. And so their whole thing, for their production is they have a garlic grilled cheese stand that's like drive-through. And so now they will have to cut that by 50% because they don't have 50% of their garlic that they usually grow. And so they are typical people that seed save. And so with that, unfortunately, that comes a new cost of you can't seed save. You have to try treating your soil. Sometimes intense heat can help with that, or clear tarping has been seen to help with that in some areas. Same with fusarium wilt in tomatoes. Not far from them, a month later from this farm, I get a call that they have fusarium in their tomatoes, which you can see in that right photo over there. It mimics some nutrient deficiencies. And so that's where diseases can get really tough, because a lot of diseases look similar and they can also mimic nutrient deficiencies. And so sending them to your plant clinic, as well as taking good photos and sending that to them, can also really help with what your issue is, as well as just contacting Extension. They can help you with coming up with good cultural and mechanical controls for a lot of these, so that they're not an issue for the next year. And of course, some of our most common ones, powdery mildew and alternaria, those are really common in our cucurbit crops. I experienced alternaria in broccoli and cucumbers this year. And a lot of that for us is because we have such heavy clay soils that it makes it really difficult for the roots to take hold in our soils, and it also can help with water retention. Our soils tend to hold more water, and so that it causes more issues with diseases. I didn't think I would move here and experience disease. And of course, love this. The first call I ever received in Illinois Extension was about squash vine borer, which, if you followed me during my grad school experience, you know that I experienced this in my grad project, and it affected a lot of my crops. The first year when I was doing a delicata squash, we didn't really hear about anybody that had squash vine borer infiltration issues. And so we had no idea what to do. It's very hard to manage. And then, of course, we had the issue again next year. We did start new plots. They were relatively close though, and we did have that issue again. So my first year, I think 75% of my plants were affected. And then the second year in 2023, 60% of my plants were affected. So it did go down, and we were proactive, but it definitely caused problems. And so this is a very frustrating insect that can burrow into cucurbit stems. And so it's a moth on that bottom right there that pupates in the soil. And then once those pupas hatch, they infiltrate the stems and suck the life out of the plant. And they essentially start to yellow, and the plants kind of flop over and die a little bit. It's kind of like a slow, gradual decline. It can mimic symptoms of bacterial wilt and cucurbit yellow vine disease. I actually stumped somebody, a professor at Iowa State once, and asked, like, how can you tell the difference? Because it's very difficult to tell the difference unless you start to see the squash vine borer in there. But another thing about this is that squash vine borer loves mulched soils. It's actually a very optimal environment for them because it helps them to overwinter. So that's definitely something to think about if you do practice that. And so to help with these, like I said, they're very hard to treat. Research has shown that, it's hard once they burrow into those stems. And so you can try to help monitor them with installing pheromone traps to help monitor the spread. That's what that is on the bottom right there. Depending on how big your field is, you might need a few. And that can help collect the moths, so if it's a concern. Also, spring or fall tillage can help disrupt the overwintered pupas. And then I've only known 1 or 2 growers that have actually done this. So Arbico Organics does carry a beneficial nematode that can eliminate overwintered squash vine borer pupa. And I've actually never known a grower that's done it for a squash vine borer, but I have known one that has done it for Colorado potato beetle, and they've like never had problems with it. So I did, the grower that did have this concern, I recommended fall tillage, and then they did apply the nematodes because they do sell out pretty quickly. And we're going to see what happens this coming spring. But some other ways when it is occurring, you can apply BT to the base of the stem, or you can inject the cucurbit stem once it's affected. But it's really hard. We sprayed BT when I was in grad school at the base of the stem, and it really didn't do anything. It was kind of too late. But I did notice in my bare ground squash that was just insanely large, they weren't as affected by those squash vine borers because the plants were just so large that it took multiple of them to start taking the plants down. So that would be a really fun study to do, how that affects your yield with unaffected and affected plants. And then another way, we did try this my first year. I'm not really sure how well it worked. You may be able to cut a slit into the base of the stem vertically. And you could take tweezers and just kind of pull that mealworm pupa looking thing out, and you can form a cast around the base of the stem with mud. It's not a guaranteed fix, but we did try it. And again, I'm not really sure how much it really did help. But we did take essentially the infection out of the plant to try and manage it. So its lovely friends, squash bugs and cucumber beetles. These are really common problems with cucurbit crops. I hear about it all the time. I had them this year too, and they really annoyed me. They suck the sap out of the leaves and they start to cause browning and yellowing. So if you have squash or cucurbit plants that start to get that odd die-off border on those leaves, it's probably from squash bugs or cucumber beetles. The fruit isn't directly affected, but it can cause yield decreases with some of these. And they can be as active starting in early June. So they're usually an issue throughout the season, and there's multiple life stages as far as squash bugs go. Cucumber beetles are vectors for bacterial wilt, and squash bugs are vectors for cucurbit yellow vine disease. Illinois is the top producing pumpkin state in the nation. One of my counties is actually in the top 10 producing in Illinois. So this is a common call that I get. Unfortunately, cucumber beetles and squash bugs especially, can be difficult to manage. So let's talk about how to treat the squash bugs. So those are hard because once they turn into adults, they start to get a really hard exterior exoskeleton. And so they don't take chemical very well, and there's not really much that can really treat them. So some growers that I've seen as far as zone 7, and this is really difficult when you start to get into zone 4 and 5 because we have a shorter season, is trying to starve those populations by planting a little bit later. I know my first year we didn't plant squash until I think mid to late June, and it still looked really good. So maybe trying to push until early July can help that. I know for us in Illinois, we typically plant pumpkins in mid-July, and you can get away with it early August. It just might be a small crop. And another thing I really recommend is look at your sheets. Look at your spreadsheets, your income, your marketability. Can you take a year off? What is your profitability on these crops? And that doesn't mean, how much does it sell for at the market? Is it profitable? You have to look at your input costs too, because yes, cucurbits are easier to manage once, they are trained throughout the season. They start to get those roots set in and the fruit going, but they are harder to get started at the beginning. You kind of have to baby them a little bit. So you have to think about, is this worth the time that I'm going to put in? And is it worth the damage that these pests are going to do? So you really have to think about your input costs, your seed costs, your labor costs, compared to how much you're selling it for. And can you really take a year off to kind of help with these problems? Another thing, you know, they love hiding under cardboard. If you've ever left cardboard out there, they'll be hiding out there. That's actually a good way to attract them too, is to just lay cardboard flat on, you know, your plastic mulch or whatever growing media you use, and to pick it up and take it somewhere else. That's a really good way. For some reason, they really like hiding under there. Another way it's really hard if you're a larger production system is to hand pick the pests, or you can crush the eggs. I've seen a grower, they put duct tape on the opposite end on their hand, so sticky side is up, and they just wrap it around their wrist, and they'll go around and just take off all the bugs using that tape, so they're not having to you know, use their fingers. They can harvest and do that at the same time, you know, if it's a zucchini or a cucumber crop, or if they're planting another crop and doing that. There are few insecticidal soaps that can treat this, so that's also another thing to think about. And let's talk about cucumber beetles. So these are relatively similar. You can starve, you know, the plants, you can take a year off, you can clean up the debris. These can be treated with pyrethrin or neem, may help treat them. But these are vectors for bacterial wilt. And I know when I was in South Dakota and we had striped cucumber beetles, it really affected our cucurbits. I had them in all of my squash fields, and we had melons not too far from us in a high tunnel study, and all of the ones in the open field got bacterial wilt, and it was really sad, and they were mushy on the inside, and it made me sad because I love melons. So definitely something to consider. They are a really heavy disease vector. And you can use kaolin clay. We actually did experiment and think about using that for my crop. And this may actually work well with some of our drought conditions because it causes a gummy coating on the leaves. And it kind of just starts to like make the pests not want to go there. They get kind of turned off with it. However, you do have to start reapplying once rain does come because it will wash off. And so if you do have a heavy pest infestation, I don't recommend using this because it's just beyond the point of this being effective. But if you do see a few and you're starting to get concerned, I don't think it's a bad thing to do if you are somebody that wants to consider more natural alternatives. And oddly enough, and who knows, maybe you guys have had some problems with this. This was new to me. Pill bugs or roly-polies are like completely decimating brassica crops. It is so strange. So fun story. This started at the southern end of the state. We got word from a professor on campus, and you know that it was eating and destroying certain crops' root systems, as well as just eating all the brassica crops. And we were kind of like, no way, like it's a roly-poly, it's a pill bug, like what is that going to do? And my coworker in Cook County, they have a demonstration high tunnel there. He's like, well, I've seen them before, you know, it can't hurt my crops. And it did. The next day he went in there and all of his lettuce was gone. It was completely eaten. The infestation got so bad with these roly-polies, pill bugs. And again, they're very hard armored, so they're really hard to manage. And earwigs were also a problem, as well as Japanese beetles. They trended the same way. So they started on a lot of our cut flower crops. They really like the petals for some reason. And then once those were kind of starved out and they got tired of eating the leaves or they were gone, then they started to make their way to those brassica crops as well. So it's very interesting, and I'm not quite sure what's going on with the ecosystem to cause this, but it definitely is a concern because this was never usually an issue for us in the past. So other bothersome insects, aphids, that was a really big problem this year as well. it was just really hot and dry. And we went almost a month without any rainfall. Like we were starting to get really concerned because, you know, out here that's not normal. So people were starting to get a little freaked out. And they were just so bad. You know, a lot of people would have to spray neem oil pretty heavily, you know, and follow the label. And it just seemed like even that, you know, wasn't enough. And by the time we would get rain, they would kind of start to vanish a little bit. But once it started to get dry again, they'd come right back. And so you can treat these with neem. You can also apply lady beetles. If you can find an ethical source to buy these and get these, you can apply lady beetles. That's a biological control. They love aphids, especially if you're in a greenhouse. That's a really good place to do it. I know we've done that in the past. Cabbage loopers, those turn into cabbage moths. They eat everything. They completely decimated all of my broccoli leaves when I was in South Dakota. And that same thing was happening here. And then we got alternaria. So the plant just kind of decided its fate for us. But you can apply BT or pyrethrin to these as well. Same with cross-striped cabbage worms. I didn't even know that these existed until I moved here. And mealy bugs. I have those on my succulents a lot. So those can be an issue. I also had them on my brassicas, my broccoli this year. And that can actually be treated with 10 to 25% isopropyl alcohol mixture. And they'll just come right off. They tend to leave like a mold and a webbing on certain plants. And that can also affect them because they also pupate really quickly. And we also confirmed the spotted lanternfly in Illinois as well, actually in DuPage County, the urban county I serve. So if that's not, I don't think that's in South Dakota yet, but who knows, it might come that way eventually. And they eat like fruiting crops like crazy, especially tree fruits. So definitely something to think about if you produce tree fruits. So we did talk about production things, you know, like pests and diseases, but I wanted to jump in and talk more about the actual system and some of the trends that we're starting to see in Illinois that may affect South Dakota or make you think of other things to consider. So many growers here are using plastic mulch or, you know, the woven landscape fabric. Those are both common in South Dakota too. I know plastic mulch is a big thing. It's easy to install. It's not labor intensive. I use black woven landscape fabric for my research. That's a photo right there. Growers are just getting really frustrated because plastic mulch is a single-use plastic, so they essentially have to get rid of it after the first year. So that's really frustrating. You know, people don't like waste. And the woven landscape fabric can also cause issues, you know, once you reuse it, which it's awesome that you can reuse it, you know, that is really helpful to growers, but it's also very labor intensive to apply the staples. So I've actually had some growers use like huge, huge rocks, you know, that you find in the fields after you till. They've used those. They've used some sandbags. You know, where some of these people are, it's more wooded, so they don't have to deal with the wind as much. So that can definitely help. But once you start to apply those staples all the time, like you start to get frayed edges, and year after year after year, you know, when you start to use those, it just completely starts shredding. And so you can't really see it that much in this photo, but you can see that it's woven. I know, you know, when I was in South Dakota, my plots would just completely shred from, you know, the mower being mowed to use the living mulch and things like that. So people are starting to get concerned with that. And they're also not a huge fan of biodegradable mulch because even though it is biodegradable, it still is like shreds of paper in their field and they have to go and clean it up. It's the same for plastic mulch. So they're not big into that either. And so it's just starting to raise a lot of questions of like, what do they do? Because it helps manage the weeds, obviously. And, you know, who wants to go out there and weed all the time, especially if you have a big system? You know, so they're starting to kind of go back to the basics of just applying, you know, weed-free hay mulch, straw mulch, using heavy compost applications. A lot of growers make it themselves. It's pretty easy, but if you're certified organic, you usually have to have some like protocols there to manage, you know, the temperature and what you're putting in and making sure that's organic. And so we do have a USDA certified supplier here that we do order from. But that can still cause issues if there's weed seeds in there. Have to make sure it's an ethical supplier. But they are going back to that because they're just really tired of plastic. They're really over it. And so they are still using plastic. If they're a cover cropped operation, especially the no-till growers, I'm noticing that a lot of them will cover crop and then they'll apply a tarp over that to help smother it. And then they will plant right into that, you know, terminated cover crop plot. And so it kind of can help with those weeds and provide a mulched layer for them. But there are some concerns with that, you know, especially we've seen it with crimp cereal rye. It's an awesome mulch bed. But if you start to get really heavy rains, it can cause disease problems for sure, especially in melon production, tomato, pepper production. It can start to cause a lot of disease problems in there. So great alternative, but definitely think about that if you are expecting a heavy rain season. But needless to say, a lot of this is starting to increase interest in living mulch, cover cropping, companion planting, and all natural alternatives for that matter. We actually don't have a horticulture production faculty on campus, so we do have a big gap in some of our production research. And so farmers actually don't know much about living mulch, but they are becoming really interested in it. So that's really fun that I get to take my research here and talk more about it. But yeah, and so here's more photos. The photo on the left there is from Hannah Boy. She's a previous colleague of mine at SDSU studying soil tarping for her graduate thesis. And then on the right is just a photo of plastic mulch in case you aren't aware of that. You can see that when you cut the hole and throughout the season, some of those branches can cause holes in the plastic as well, and it can cause more debris. And high tunnels. So I did talk about the intense heat that we're having here. And it's definitely causing problems with our high tunnels. So when I was in South Dakota, I never used to have to really think about shade cloth really that much. I lived on a farm. I lived at Good Roots in Brookings, so I have seen so many different types of things. And yeah, we never really had to use it there. You know, roll up sides and fans, really properly working fans and opening the doors is really helpful. But we are noticing extreme heat. And I had a grower, brand new grower. I feel so bad for them, you know, paving their way. And they bought a high tunnel that didn't have roll up sides. And their tomato crops just completely died. And their grape tomatoes were just like roasted to death with how hot it got in there. They would open the door, but it just wasn't sufficient airflow. So if you are in a high tunnel and experiencing intense heat, I really, really, really recommend putting a temperature gauge in there so you know how hot it's getting. Thinking about rolling up the sides, thinking about what crops are going in there for your time of season. A crop plan is really important, as well as those fans. And also think about, you know, do I need a shade cloth? You know, that can be labor intensive. It's another thing you have to add on. But that can essentially save your crops. I know Dr. Lang worked on that when she was in grad school, so she's definitely someone to talk to about that. But working in high tunnels also make sure, you know, that you're safe and you're not in there when it's extremely hot. We tend to work in them out here, you know, really early mornings, like I said, and late night. I know that's a common practice out there too, but just make sure you're being safe. It gets so hot in there. It's like an incubator. It's not comfortable. And so a little bit to touch on urban ag. So urban ag is interesting. I don't have a whole lot of urban growers, although I do teach the Master Urban Farmer Training course with Cook County, which is usually on the south side of Cook County. Chicago is actually like the city itself is actually really big on promoting local foods and keeping farms in the city or starting farms there. They have a whole high school dedicated to it. So it's really fun that they're really interested in it and the community can get really involved. But there are some regulations with that. And so because you're in a city, you do have to worry about, runoff issues. Is there a sewer nearby? How is your, do you have issues with water on your property? Do you have a creek running through? Is there a train track nearby? I mean, those are all things we do have to think about. As well as, pollution, what's the car traffic like near your plot? Is there smog issues? We are, having to deal with lead there. Chicago was a huge, factory space. It's still a huge warehouse space. So some of these things, we do have to think about lead here and lead testing. So we do heavy metals testing. And I know that in the Northeast region of the states, in Maine and Vermont, they are concerned about PFAS, the forever chemicals that were in Teflon pans for a long time. Well, it's in more than Teflon pans. And so that's another thing that we have to think about out here in our urban areas. And that might be something to think about in the urban areas in South Dakota, because I know that there are some growers in Sioux Falls, for example. Irrigation access and structure development is also can be a struggle. Sometimes, you have to follow city guidelines. You're not on agriculture zoning land. You're in municipality residential areas typically. So there are usually limits on the structures that you can build. You can usually build small hoop houses, but you can't build large high tunnels, which can really inhibit some of what people are trying to grow as well as what they're bringing to the market. And the biggest thing that I talked about a little bit was soil stripping and development. So especially in DuPage, my furthest east county, closest to Chicago, this is a really big problem. So when you develop homes and neighborhoods, they take that top layer of soil off and what's left is usually really heavy clay. And that's exactly how my backyard is. It's like a really fun experiment and good education for my dad because he loves gardening and wants to know more on why his plants look the way that they do. But it's frustrating because our ground is essentially all clay. And so that can really cause a lot of our root systems that have trouble sprawling and spreading in that clay. They just can't go anywhere. And like I said earlier, we trap a lot of rainfall and water, precipitation in our soils as well. So it's hard to get an even watering when that happens because sometimes it looks like it's dry on the top. And even when you sink your hand in, it just holds way too much water. So it's really important to look at a USDA soil survey to kind of know exactly what your soils are. And you can kind of help determine how much water you need from there, but it's hard and it's definitely a concern. So that definitely, people are starting to do a lot more raised beds like you can see over here. This is a farm called Cultivate Cook County. They have a lot of raised beds and, that's just kind of the best way to do it because when you use potting soil or topsoil, you can get better soil leaching as well as root development. And then it's just a really nice foundation to have because or else you're going to have really stunted plants. This year we had really stunted plants in my garden, which was sad, but fun experiment. I'm not used to soils like that. So, and briefly wanted to touch one slide on markets because I know that marketability and profitability is really important, especially in farming when you are direct to consumer. So I am not a business person, but I have learned a lot from my business colleague that does a lot of this for our urban farmer training program. And from what I've seen and just from growers, what I've been hearing, and I can't speak to this in South Dakota. I know the Sioux Falls market and the Black Hills markets are like amazing. But at least out here, if you're not in city proper, the Chicago city, the farmers markets are not as profitable as they once were pre-COVID. People kind of go and look at them as more of like a fun hangout spot because now places are bringing food trucks and they thought, the food trucks would bring more attention to these farmers and vendors, but it's actually not. It's doing the complete opposite. And so that is causing some pitfalls there. And so a lot of growers are moving towards delivery because, you know, even though these growers are on the outskirts of the city, it's not convenient for consumers to drive to. I mean, even for me, you know, most of these growers are 40 minutes away from me and I'm in the suburbs. And so I'm not going to drive 40 minutes to go get, you know, produce or a CSA share. So a lot of them will bring it to the markets for pickup. They're also doing delivery. They're partnering with other growers. So a lot of my vegetable growers do have livestock. They have pigs or hogs, laying hens for sure. Poultry is actually really common out here for broilers, as well as sheep and cattle. So a lot of them will partner with other growers to kind of diversify that market a little bit, or wellness and natural products. And farmers are also trying to expand their CSA shares to help with those issues as well. Partnering with local businesses. I cannot think of the hot sauce company that was out there. They just closed a little bit. They're not doing internationally now. I'm mad that I can't think of it, but I'm sure you guys will know who I'm talking about. We have a hot sauce company out here that tends to partner with a lot of our growers. We also have local fine dining restaurants that will also partner with a lot of our growers, and they will, you know, usually proudly show that they are buying from, you know, XYZ farmer. And then that also, you know, shows the consumer, you know, the person that's visiting that restaurant, you know, like, cool, I'm eating from so and so. And then that, you know, shows marketing, free marketing essentially for that farmer. And so that's really cool too. Another thing, people don't like kale or beets. That's like such a funny line I've heard lately. Having some education there at your booth, if you are at a good market, can really help with that, or showing ways to prepare it. Because sometimes people just don't know how to prepare it. They don't know that, you know, kale is in their favorite soup, or it's that bitter piece in that salad. They just think kale and it's bitter and gross, I'm not going to eat it. Or beets, they taste like earth, I'm not going to eat it. So sometimes showing that can really help. But we're also seeing a big market squeeze here, with an influx of new growers. So that raises the question of, you know, how are you different from these other growers? For example, in the Driftless region, there's like way too many vegetable growers. So some of them have actually transitioned into orchard growing or cut flower growing, which is very funny because orchards are a lot different than vegetables, but it gives the market some differentiation. And even cut flowers, we're starting to see a big influx of cut flowers and vegetables, really, for that matter, and pumpkins too. I mean, we're the top producing state, so a lot of people will wholesale pumpkins, but you don't make a lot of money doing that. And so some people will, you know, have a trailer outside and they'll try and sell, but it just doesn't go over quite as well all the time. So, you know, trying to sell decorative pumpkins, you know, how are you different? You know, what market can you go to? We've got some cut flower growers that are being squeezed at the market now because of all the competition. So they're leaning more towards weddings and events or dried flowers. So they have something in the middle of the season, things like that. Those are definitely some things to concern. I know, or to consider. I know South Dakota is a bit smaller, but, you know, local food and cut flower farms are growing out there from what I can see. So things to take home. Please don't seed save if you notice disease in your fields. Try to buy disease resistant seeds if you can. I know sometimes that can be really hard, in organic certification as well with treated seed. Pest scout, you know, have a crop plan, a pest scouting plan, check for diseases, monitor temperature and rainfall. You know, are you harvesting adequately? Always read the label when you're applying chemicals, fertilizer, sprays, pesticides, herbicides, anything. Please read the label and follow the label. Contact your local extension office if you have concerns. I'm sure Dr. Lang and Dr. Burrows would be very happy to help you. I'm sure Robin Buderbaugh would be so happy to help you. And send plant samples to the plant clinic. Take good photos for them. This is like a whole presentation I've had to give to growers as well and master gardeners, because they, you know, get so excited, but the photos are never good for us to ID. So please, you know, try to take close-up photos, all around photos, different sides of the plant. Please do. It's really helpful for us in extension. And I just wanted to end with some acknowledgments. Thank you to SDSU Extension for having me here. Dr. Lang and Dr. Rose taught me for 2 years on my project, and I would not be here if it wasn't for them. So thank you. Illinois Extension for having me, as well as Kane County. My position's brand new, and it was funded off of the USDA Urban Ag and Innovation Grant for the first year, and then I will continue on through county funds. So just wanted to thank them for the funding and allowing me to be here and share. This is a much needed position, and I'm so happy to be here. And if there are any questions, I can definitely take those. And here is my contact information as well. I'll leave this up here for a little while. I serve DuPage, Kane, and Kendall, and I'm a local food systems small farms educator. Thank you all for having me. I can take questions.
Yeah, I'm not seeing any questions. I have one.
Okay.
Are you seeing, you mentioned some growers were interested in the living mulch systems, have some curiosity. Are there any particular crops that are driving that interest?
Yeah, so mainly tomatoes and peppers. Those just seem to be a huge seller here. I know that there's been some interest in cut flowers too. Strangely enough, I don't know how well that would work. I'm curious to see how that would work. But it's mainly peppers and tomatoes just because most of my growers, they've got fields upon fields of it, or they try and sell wholesale, or they're at the markets, and it's just a really pesky crop to deal with when you're weeding. So that tends to be the crop that they go to.
I'm curious how it would be with cut flower crops.
I know. I wonder about that too, because I mean, it's already flowering, and if it's because we did find in my research that the yields were suppressed by living mulches, at least in the first year. So I wonder with cut flowers, what would the blooms look like? How long would the stems be? Would the stems be affected? I do wonder about that too. That'd be a fun study to do.
I know there's some areas in South Dakota, especially on the sand plains, if you grow cut flowers and you have open ground, that sand can just last
Yeah,
the
that
plants.
too.
So we do have one comment that they just wanted to say thank you for the good content.
Oh,
and
thanks.
I will echo that. Thank you for your time and effort and an informative and interesting presentation. And we want to thank our audience for joining us tonight as well. And I'd like to also thanks to Kira for her technical assistance this evening. And if she can drop in the link for the survey, we would really appreciate it if our audience will take time to fill out a survey on tonight's presentation and the series. And then we look forward to seeing everyone again Tuesday, January 28th, next Tuesday, to learn from a mechanical engineer about engineering a better high tunnel. I think this is going to be a really fun session. Chanel Muchknos is a engineer slash researcher slash farmer who's been working with greenhouse heat storage systems for the lower cost systems. So he's going to share his knowledge about systems he's worked with, and I know he's been tinkering with this for years, and has some fun designs and really interesting content. And a reminder that each short course can also be found on the SDSU Extension YouTube channel in case you want to rewatch it or you miss a session or you'd like to share it with others. And last year's are available there as well. So if you want to see what Alexis talked about last year, uh, and again, thank you for being with us tonight and for completing our survey. And it was really good to see you again, Alexis. I wish you well in your position.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so happy to be back and talking to this audience.
With that, we'll close it out. Thank you, everyone. And we'll leave it up for a minute so that you can grab that link and get to the survey.
Alexis, you had one question in the Q&A. Do you think hot, dry weather in July would reduce female pumpkin flowers?
I don't know specifically about female. I mean, you're definitely going to see a reduction in flowers in general, just because the plant does start to go into survival mode. But as far as female flowers, I have heard people talk about that before, but I'm not sure offhand. I don't know if you would know, Dr. Burrows, but
I know cooler weather will favor male flowers. So with the female, it might not be the weather as much as just plain drought stress. Hot temperatures usually aren't good for any kind of pollination.
mm-hmm.
It looks like you have another one there. Is BT
I'm not sure
available?
what S.
Pardon?
Yeah, I mean, you can get BT pretty much at any pesticide supplier, or really any like home improvement store, really for that matter. It's Bacillus thuringiensis. And I'm not sure what SWD is. Somebody said any
Spotted wing
SWD.
Drosophila.
Oh yeah, we have that in raspberry production mostly. But I don't really have many growers that do raspberries here. Our weather's too volatile to grow them.
Mm. Yeah. A note about BT, there are different kinds of BTs for different insects. So the BT that might be used, for example, on mosquitoes will be different than one that is used on caterpillars. So just double check with that. But I think the caterpillar ones will get most of the insects that we're wanting to to treat.
Mhm.
All right, that looks like it's it for tonight.
Okay, cool.
Thanks once again.